Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagatgurum. Good evening. Happy Holi. USC is celebrating Holi, so it's appropriate that we have a Gita class today. We have covered up to shloka 69 out of 72 of chapter 2. So only 3 shlokas left in this long and very interesting chapter, first chapter. So what I'll do is we'll first go through the remaining 3 shlokas. Then I'll give a brief overall summary of chapter 2. Then we'll move on to chapter 3, depending on how much time we have. Okay. So please open the app as usual and shloka 70. 2.70.
It's the storage area.
Huh? Oh,
Storage area.
from the other room.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway. Okay, so please recite after me. Keep in mind, this is one of the first shlokas that's in a longer meter, poetic meter. So it's going to be 11 syllables per quarter instead of 8. But we'll break it up. Apuryamanam.
Apuryamanam.
Achala pratishtham.
Achala pratishtham.
Samudramapaha.
Samudramapaha.
Pravishanti.
Pravishanti.
Yadvad.
Yadvat.
Tadvat kama.
Tadvat kama.
Yam pravishanti sarve.
Yam pravishanti sarve.
Sashantim apnoti.
Sajantim apnoti.
Nakamakami.
Nakamakami.
When I first started studying the Gita, when I was a grad student like you guys, this is one of my favorite shlokas. It's very beautiful, actually, very poetic. So let's look at the Anvaya. Yadvat, just as what? Just as what? Apaha, streams, waters. Apuryamanam achala pratishtham samudram. So samudram is the main noun here. Ocean, right? Sea. What kind of ocean? The kind of ocean which remains completely still and undisturbed. Achala pratishtham. Even while being continuously filled with apuryamanam, with different streams of water. Apaha apuryamanam achala pratishtham samudram. Pravishanti. Just as those streams of water enter this ocean, which is somehow never disturbed, even though the waters are constantly rushing into it. Tadvat, just so. Sarve kama. Now, this term kama is a point of controversy among commentators. What exactly it is? So I'm going to leave it untranslated for now. All kamas. Yam pravishanti. In that person in whom all kamas enter, in the way that these different streams of water enter this ocean, and where the ocean remains completely undisturbed. So if a person is like that, all sorts of kamas will come, but that person remains completely undisturbed. Saha, that person, shantim apnoti, attains peace. Na kama kami. Again, this kama word comes again, twice in one word, kama kami. Only that person attains peace. That person in whom all these kamas enter, but without being disturbed, as opposed to the kamakami. Kamakami, the person who is desirous of, well, okay, again, this is a little bit, depends on the meaning of kama, but kama often means desires. So kami would mean somebody who's desirous of something. Desirous of what? The previous kama. One who is desirous of desires. Okay. But there are other translations, renderings, depending on the commentator and the interpretation. So that's what I want to get into briefly. And you'll find that it's not just a technical issue. Actually, it's relevant to our spiritual life, actually, to our sadhana. So, as I said, there's this. Okay, but let's read Sri Aurobindo's translation. He, or nowadays we'll say that person attains peace, into whom all desires enter as waters into the sea, which is ever being filled, apuryamanam, yet ever motionless, achala pratishtam. Not that person who, like troubled and muddy waters, is disturbed by every little inrush of desire. So this is Sri Aurobindo's translation, and of course, other commentators will have slightly different translations, but you get the basic idea, I hope. A very beautiful metaphor about how a true spiritual aspirant should handle desires and or sense objects, depending on what kama is here. Okay, so now let's get to the point of controversy. Remember, there are two words here with kama in it. One is tadvat kama. The other is kama kami. What does kama mean? Shankara takes that first kama to mean desires, as we might expect. But in that phrase, kama kami at the end, he doesn't take that to be desires. He takes that to be sense objects. That kama. So he says that kama kami means one who is desirous of sense objects. Because he says it's a little weird to say that's, or he's thinking, his intuition is, it sounds a little weird to say one who's desirous of desires. Sounds paradoxical, or maybe like, what do you call it? Recursion in programming, huh? So he says that kami means desirous of, but kama is not desire. It should be taken as sense object because it makes more sense that way. And kama, though, in the other word, he takes to be desires. So one might argue that there's a bit of an inconsistency. He's translating kama as desires, and then suddenly in the same verse, he's taking the same word kama as sense objects. Anyway, that's up to you to decide. I just want to mention some other interpretations, and then we'll talk about why it's relevant. Ramanuja and Swami Tapasinandaji, a monk of the Ramakrishna order, who's done his own, I wouldn't quite call it a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, but translation and notes on the Gita, not on every verse. So Tapasinandaji and Ramanuja they have the virtue of consistency. They interpret both kama and kama kami consistently, but both as objects of desire rather than as desires. So tatvat kama yam pravishanti sarve means in those people in whom objects of desire, sense objects, enter without that person getting disturbed at all. That person attains peace, not the kama kami, not the person who is desirous of objects of desire. Okay, following? And there's a third interpretation. This is defended by Sri Aurobindo. He takes both the terms to mean desires. Kama means desires entering somebody, but that person is undisturbed. Unlike the kama kami, who is. And here he doesn't exactly render it as the person who is desirous of desires, but he says he's the person who is, the kama kami is somebody who is disturbed by every little inrush of desire. And here he's really taking liberties because kami really means desirous of, that nobody questions. But for some reason, none of the commentators go for the very literal meaning of the word kama kami, which would mean literally desirous of desires. But I feel like I kind of like the absolutely literal, almost etymological meaning of the term. Some people love desire. In fact, when I first became a monk, some people would tell me, but what's the point in living if there's no without desire? And it's very common, especially in the West. It's like you lose all desire to live, all motivation for life if you don't have desire. Because what's the guiding force behind life? Well, it has to be desire. I want to do something in order to, I should want something in order to do something, right? That's the logic. That's also Shankara's logic. Avidya kama karma is a famous formula in Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Avidya kama karma. This comes up all the time in his commentaries. Avidya means ignorance. From ignorance of what? Can you guess? In the case of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta?
Kushal.
The true self, which is the nature of what?
Brahman.
But everybody believes in Brahman. But what's Brahman according to Shankara?
Impersonal.
Yeah.
awareness.
Yeah, Nirguna Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness. You can call it many different things. So long as we remain ignorant of our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, what happens? Desires arise, kama. As a result of those desires, what happens? What arises? The desire to act. Because it doesn't make sense to act unless you have some reason for acting. I want something, therefore I act, right? This is the whole logic of Shankara's philosophy. This becomes important, especially in the next chapter, because this is a very controversial chapter among the commentators. Again and again, Shankara says that action, work, is only for people who are ignorant and who mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex, who have not yet attained sufficient purity of mind. But there are other schools of thought, including Sri Aurobindo in his commentary. He's saying the whole purpose of the Gita is to refute that position. And the whole purpose of the Gita is to say that even through karma yoga, you can attain the highest. Okay, but we'll get there. I'm jumping the gun a little bit. But I sort of, as I said, I kind of prefer so I follow Sri Aurobindo in taking the kama to mean desires. So just as desires enter somebody, but that person remains completely undisturbed. And kama-kami, I take, unlike I think any of these commentators, at least that I've found, that there are these two different kinds of people. Spiritual aspirants are people who are trying to conquer or to overcome or transcend desire. And worldly people are those who cling to their desires. They like their desires. Desire is a spice of life. Without desire, what are we left with? This kind of idea. But the reason why I think this is relevant to sadhana, because it seems to me, and this is my own reading, and you can disagree, but I'm just proposing it here. Shloka 70 and Shloka 71, which we're about to discuss, are both about overcoming desire. And both very relevant in spiritual life, because spiritual aspects are always struggling with desires. But it prescribes two different methods for handling desires. 70 takes an approach that I would liken to Buddhist mindfulness. Are any of you familiar with Buddha's teachings in the Tipitaka? No?
There's some Buddham Sharanam.
Okay, yeah, that's true. But that comes, is that in the Tipitaka? That must be later, because that means I take refuge in Buddha. But Tipitaka means Buddha himself, his teachings in Pali. So there's a very famous, the textual source for mindfulness practice. Now it's such a popular thing throughout the world, especially in the West. It can be traced to one particular sutta in the Tipitaka called the Satipatthana Sutta. And there, sati means, it's the Pali word for smriti. And smriti here means mindfulness. In the Buddhist context, smriti means mindfulness. And he says, what is the practice of mindfulness? It's very interesting, beautiful language. And he says, roughly, I'm just paraphrasing. He says, whenever any kind of feeling arises in your mind, whether pleasant or unpleasant, just note it. Note the fact that this particular kind of feeling has arisen, but don't get attached to it. Don't identify with it. Just watch as a witness. Be mindful of it. This is another term for it that's very common in among modern Buddhists. They use the term to non-judgmental awareness. Be non-judgmentally aware and don't freak out, because the more you freak out, the more power you give the desires or the feelings or the thoughts. You just become. And so this verse really captures this spirit. Notice the ocean is unruffled, completely undisturbed, in spite of the inrush of all these waters. In the same way, don't freak out if some unpleasant or unwanted thought or desire or feeling comes into the head. Take a step back from those thoughts and feelings and say, I'm not that thought. I'm not going to identify with it. Let it come and go. What is that to me? And so he says, Buddha says, in the same way, just as you let feelings come and go, you also let thoughts arise in the mind, let them dissipate. And as long as you're not bothered by it, you're not obsessed with the thought, then it'll come and it'll go, just like any passing wave. I thought you'd be full of holy colors, but so you had to change and
Yes.
yes, okay. It's good. You're in the spirit of Krishna consciousness now.
Yes.
Okay, so this is why I would characterize this shloka 70 as prescribing like the Vedāntic counterpart or the Vedāntic equivalent to this mindfulness approach to dealing with desires that arise in the mind. Don't freak out. Don't identify with them. Don't sort of be like a warrior and say, I'm going to fight this desire and this and that. Not even that. That comes in the next shloka, as far as I can tell. But in this one, it's not about fighting the desire. Don't even treat it like your enemy. Just let it come and let it go. Who cares? You're unbothered because you don't identify with that, whatever that desire is. Worldly desire, obviously. Not desire for God, which is a good desire. Now, by contrast, and as I said, this is just my interpretation, and there are other ways of interpreting. Let's look at the next shloka, which I see as prescribing a different method, an alternative method for dealing with desires. And one thing about Buddha's teachings is that there's another sutta in the Tipitaka, I don't remember the name of it, where he explains 5 or 6 different methods of handling unwanted thoughts. It's very interesting. One of them is mindfulness. Another one is head-on confrontation. Because the idea is the mind is in different moods and in different times based on which guna predominates. If you're feeling very sattvic, maybe it's easier to do this mindfulness practice. If you're very rajasic, you might, you'll have more of like the warrior's attitude. You want to fight with the desire. If you're tamasic, then I don't know. Lord help you. It's the most dangerous state for a spiritual aspect. You might just fall asleep and then. Okay, so let's look at the shloka 71. Vihaya kaman
Vihaya kaman
yak sarvan
Yes.
puman.
puman
Okay, with sandhi it becomes pumamsh, but anyway. Charati
Charati.
nispriha
Nispriyaha.
nirmamo
Nirmamo.
nirahankaraha
Nirahankara.
sashantim
Sashantim.
adhigacchati.
Adhigacchati.
Okay, Anvaya, yaha, that person, that puman, that person, sarvan kaman vihaya, having abandoned, having renounced, having given up, sarvan kaman, all desires. Nirmamaha, completely devoid of this mamata, egoism, me and mine. Nirahankaraha, this everyone knows, I assume, completely free from egoism. Good. Nispriyaha. Spriha is desire. Nispriya means completely free from desire. Charati is interesting here. I'll get to it in a second. But it literally means somebody who acts or walks. Saha, that person, shantim adhigacchati. That person attains peace. So structurally, it's almost the same as the previous verse because they're both, the person who does X attains peace. In the previous shloka, what is that person who does X? What is it doing X? That person in whom desires enter, but who remains completely undisturbed. That's why I'm saying it's like a kind of mindfulness practice where you take a step back from your unwanted thoughts and desires, and you don't let them disturb you, and you're not even disturbed by the fact that they're there. That's the thing. That's a kind of sattvic mindfulness practice. Don't freak out, or don't even be bothered by the fact that it's there. Well, this will come up again, this practice in chapter 14. For the end, we'll discuss it maybe well, a long time from now, hopefully. Okay, but now this shloka, see, this is my interpretation. It's more active. It's a more active approach to handling desire. Vihaya kamanya sarvan. Having abandoned. This is not about taking a step back from the desires and being mindful of them and being undisturbed, but actually actively abandoning the desires, trying to uproot them. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I think, though, in spiritual life, I would say that people begin more with this active approach, 71, shloka 71, and then the more mature you get in spiritual life, the more you find that who cares if they come? Let it be in the mind. I'm not disturbed. I think it's like 71 is when there's more rajas. It's a more rajasic kind of spiritual practice for eliminating desires, where you have to kind of tackle the desires head on. And it seems to be necessary for many people in the early stages of spiritual life. But ultimately, you want to move toward a place where you can be like that vast ocean in which so many streams of water come rushing in, and the ocean remains completely undisturbed. Just like that. If you can be that kind of spiritual aspirant, spiritual life becomes very joyous, actually, because then nothing can disturb you. And you don't have to be living in a cave and not talking to anybody and not in the midst. Tremendous activity and all sorts of things. In the mind itself is like that. It's full of, but you'll remain undisturbed. So that's just my suggestion for how we one way of thinking about the relationship between 70 and 71. They're prescribing two different methods of handling and ultimately overcoming worldly desires. 70 giving us a kind of a mindfulness practice where we take a step back from the desires. Let them come and go. I'm not disturbed by them. 71 is a more of an active approach. Oh, I forgot to mention regarding 70, this mindfulness approach. Somebody came to Sri Ramakrishna one day complaining about lust. This is not in the gospel. It's in a much less well-known compilation of his teachings. I think it's called Sayings of Sri Ramakrishna, published by Chennai. Ramakrishna says, with a smile on his face, roughly along the lines of this, I'm paraphrasing. He said, oh, don't worry so much about it. Let it come. Don't be bothered by it. And he gives an example. He says, imagine that there's a dog. And every time you see that dog, you approach the dog, you pet the dog, you pamper the dog, you play with the dog, you fondle the dog. What's going to happen? That dog is going to come back again and again. Suddenly one day, that dog comes and you completely ignore it. The dog is confused. He's like, oh, what's going on? Why isn't he petting me? Why isn't he rubbing behind my ears? Why isn't he playing fetch with me? And you're not doing anything. So the dog's going to keep pestering you. And he's going to be climbing over you, licking you, wondering, confused about why you're not playing with it. So Sri Ramakrishna is basically saying this. He's saying, when you first stop playing with this dog that you've been petting for so long and indulging for so long, the dog is desire. I hope you can get that analogy by now. I hope. At first, those desires are going to disturb you, obviously, because those are your samskaras, your past habits. And then he says, but just ignore the dog. Keep ignoring the dog. And ultimately, the dog will take a hint. The dog will take the hint. And ultimately, the dog will realize my master doesn't love me anymore. Let me find a new master and go to somebody else. So in the same way, if you can deal with desire. So I see this advice of Sri Ramakrishna as more along the lines of shloka 70 rather than 71. You see, this mindfulness approach. Let the desire come. I'm not bothered by it, but I'm not going to identify with it. I'm not going to act on it. And if you can take that approach, if you can take a step back, you'll find that that desire loses all power. It's a very powerful practice, actually. Any unwanted, so it's not just about desires, any unwanted thought. If you're terrified because you have an exam coming up, that feeling of terror, let it come up, but just try to take a step back from it. That's shloka 70. Try it in any unwanted thought, whether it's anxiety or depression or fear, whatever it is, or some kind of worldly desire. This is a very potent practice. That's what I recommend. And finally, 72. Finally wrapping up this chapter. Oh, do we have questions on 70 and 71 before we move on to the last shloka?
71 also
Yes.
is saying just like abandon, right? Where does he say like you have to face?
Oh, well, okay. I mean, abandon. Maybe I'm overreading, but this vihaya is I see it as a kind of active verb. Abandoning desires, having abandoned desires. 70, you don't get the sense that you are abandoning desires. Let them come. But I'm not bothered. Do you see? And I forgot, thank you for stopping me here, because I forgot to mention this charati. Sri Aurobindo let me quote from his Essays on the Gita, his commentary on this verse. He says, this person, he acts as others, like other people do, but he has abandoned all desires and their longings. See, acts as others do, charati. And he's strongly emphasizing that because one of his main antagonists throughout his commentary on the Gita is, do you know what antagonist means?
Yeah.
Who is his main antagonist? I think I mentioned this a long time ago. Can you guess? Does anybody know anything about Sri Aurobindo? Which philosophy is he arguing against? Shankara's philosophy. And we'll see why. I mean, it comes up, it's already come up a few times in the earlier shlokas, but all of these shlokas regarding the Sthita Prajna, according to Shankara, are referring to the Jnana Yogi, the follower of the path of knowledge, who has abandoned all actions, who has renounced all actions. He's a sarva karma sannyasi. And Sri Aurobindo says, this is wildly implausible in the context of the Gita, and the Gita's saying the opposite again and again, that even in the midst of great activity, if you can remain unattached, then you're a true karma yogi, and you can even reach the highest through the path of karma yoga, unattached action. You're fully engaged in action. So this word for him is another key word signaling this fact, charati. This person who is completely free from all desires continues to act in the world, contrary to Shankara's philosophy, which says that karma yoga is only for inferior spiritual aspirants who have not yet attained purity of mind. And the moment you have attained purity of mind, what happens? You stop karma yoga. You finish your bachelor's, then what do? You get your master's. Once you finish your master's, you go into PhD or you go into industry, depending on what you want to do, right? But it's one after the other. This is Shankara's view. Sri Aurobindo says, no, you can practice karma yoga and you can even attain liberation through karma yoga without having to practice jnana yoga first. Karma yoga is not a lower practice, and there's no good evidence in the Gita that karma yoga is a lower practice. And we're going to find, especially in chapter 3, very, at least arguably, pretty strong evidence in support of Sri Aurobindo's interpretation here. Through karma neva hi samsiddhim asita janakadeha is a famous shloka from the next chapter. Through karma eva, alone, Janaka and others, King Janaka, the famous King Janaka, attained perfection, siddhim. Very difficult to explain these shlokas if you accept Shankara's framework that karma yoga is only for purity of mind, not for perfection. Ultimately, you have to practice jnana yoga, then you attain perfection. Okay? So this makes sense? So thank you for reminding me. So that's the importance of this word charati here. For Sri Aurobindo, this even liberated Jivan Muktas continue to act in the world. Why? To help others, to serve others, to bring them out of their spiritual ignorance. Last shloka, 72, please look at the app. Esha Brahmi Sthitihi Partha Nainam Prapya Vimuhyati Sthitva Asyam Antakalepi Brahma Nirvanam Richati. Hey Partha, this is the Anvaya. O Partha, Arjuna. Esha Brahmi Sthitihi. Sthiti means standing firm in what? In the state of Brahman. Brahmi, in the state of Brahman. What exactly standing firm in the state of Brahman means varies from commentator to commentator. We'll get to that briefly. But in any case, resting firm in Brahman. This is the state of resting firm in Brahman. What is this? All of the previous shlokas explaining the Sthita Prajna, the person who is firmly established in steady wisdom. So this is just like a kind of a synonym for that person. That person alone rests firmly in Brahman. Enam prapya navimuhyati. Having attained this great spiritual state, na vimuhyati. That person is never more deluded. Moha comes from the same, right? That same root, verbal root. Antakale api, even at the time of death, antakala. Asyam stitva, remaining in that same Brahmic state, that same state of resting in the state of Brahman, Brahma nirvanam richati, one attains Brahma nirvana. This term came up earlier, a few weeks ago. I don't know if you remember, we were talking about the fact that nirvana is a somewhat interesting term here, unusual, we could say, because typically it's associated with which school of thought? This you should know. Nirvana, Buddhism, famous in Buddhism. Buddhism is what made nirvana, the term nirvana, famous. Buddha talked about it all the time in the Tipitaka and his teachings, right? What does nirvana literally mean? No?
Liberation.
No. Literally, etymologically, it means, anyone else want to guess? It means extinguishing or snuffing out, like a light, if there's a candle, snuffing out that candlelight. Nirvana. In Bengali, nebanu, a light, You know Bengali, or no? In Marathi, is it similar? No. Okay.
I had a classmate during undergrad.
So you
who
know
was
some Bengali.
So I understand.
And Bengalis only speak Bangla, so that you're subjected to a lot of Bengali. We always get complaints on the ashrama that the Bengalis always talk in Bengali to each other. They leave out the people who don't understand Bengali. Okay. So, Brahma Nirvanam. So what's strange about this? Nirvana in Buddhism means snuffing out. That's perfectly logical within a Buddhist framework because they don't, actually it depends on which interpretation of Buddhism, which school of Buddhism you follow. But according to many, they believe in the doctrine of anatma, anatta in Pali, the no-self doctrine. And Theravada Buddhists, for instance, they don't believe in any higher self. They don't believe in an Atman, like any kind of eternal Atman. They certainly don't believe in any God. So for them, what is the coveted spiritual goal? To attain nirvana. And if you ask them, what does nirvana mean? I think it becomes quite technical maybe, but in general, they're not going to say that you realize God. No way, because they don't believe in God. They won't even say you realize the self because they don't believe in an eternal self. Well, what else they say? It means this dream of individuality, which is the source of all suffering, is extinguished. This nightmare is over, finally. Thank God, good riddance. Nirvana. Thank God I'm not this little person that thought that it was suffering. There's nothing. Shunya. There's another famous term in Buddhism. Translated in different ways. Shunyata, void, emptiness. Different terms for it. Okay, but now the problem here is Brahma Nirvanam. And this is a Vedāntic scripture, one of the great Vedāntic scriptures, which does accept the reality of God, accepts the reality of Atman, otherwise known as Brahman, right? The supreme reality, the eternal self. And now Bhagavan Krishna is pairing the highest reality in Vedanta, which is Brahman, with this Buddhistic sounding concept of nirvana, which is more of a negative idea. Negative, not in a bad sense, negative in the sense that you don't have to posit any kind of higher reality. You're extinguishing your lower self, and what remains? Lord knows, maybe nothing. This seems to be the kind of Buddhist stance. But Brahma Nirvanam is an unusual phrase. And so some scholars think that the Bhagavad Gita postdates Buddhism, and that it appropriates this Buddhist concept of nirvana and Vedantizes it, gives it a Vedantic twist, and says, yes, you accept nirvana, we accept nirvana. You Buddhists, we'll accept it, but we'll Vedantize it by making it Brahma Nirvana. That's our goal, Brahma Nirvana. So Sri Aurobindo, for instance, before we get to Sri Aurobindo, Shankara, because he's the earliest commentator that we know of. There were other commentators, but their commentaries are no longer extant. Shankara's commentary on the Gita is the earliest extant, E-X-T-A-N-T, which means the earliest one that we still have with us. Even though in his commentary, he refers to many previous commentaries. So we know that there are previous people who wrote lots of commentaries on the Gita. In fact, there was so much confusion about the Gita that prompted Shankara to intervene and say, okay, you guys, calm down. Let me tell you what the Gita really says. Enough of this bickering. He says this in the introduction to somewhere in the early part of the commentary. So his is the first known commentary. He says, Brahma Nirvana, what does it mean? Brahma is non-dual pure consciousness, as usual for him. Nirvana means, this suits him perfectly. Why? Because he doesn't believe in the ultimate reality of individual souls. That you have a jiva, I have a separate jiva, you have a jiva. He says that's all a dream. It's all an illusion. And when we realize Brahman, our true nature is Brahman, our individuality vanishes. It's extinguished. Nirvana. So he treats Brahma Nirvana, the goal of Brahma Nirvana, to mean, he takes it to mean that the individual self is extinguished in Brahman. Brahma Nirvana. It's like the individuality is merged in non-dual pure consciousness. Sri Ramakrishna used to explain this Advaitic experience by using the analogy of a salt doll, Nuner Putul in Bengali. He said a salt doll went to measure the depths of the ocean, but the moment it set foot in the ocean, it melted in the ocean. Became one with the ocean, and then he says, who is there to measure the ocean, measure the depths of the ocean? Once you become one with the ocean, right, there's no measure anymore, no subject, no object. There's just the ocean. Similarly, Brahma Nirvanam, Shankara says, there's only Brahman, so there's no longer any individual. You can't even say the individual has realized Brahman. Even that's a kind of lower kind of explanation. From the highest standpoint, there's no realized soul even, because there are no souls. There's just Brahman and nothing else. So this Brahma Nirvanam suits Shankara quite well. Sri Aurobindo, this is one of those places where he sort of agrees with Shankara, but agrees while disagreeing at the same time. Because he also says that Brahma Nirvanam, yes, I agree with you, Shankara. It means merging of the individual self in non-dual Brahman. He agrees. But where does he disagree? He says, but this is just the last shloka of chapter 2 of an 18-chapter scripture, which means that this is not the highest or final spiritual realization. This is very interesting. Sri Aurobindo says, the Gita will go on to explain that there's an even greater spiritual experience involving what? Bhakti. Because the bhakti element has barely even come in to the Gita yet. We get the slightest hint of it. Where? In that one shloka. Matparaha, that tiny phrase, Matparaha, intent on me. Krishna saying, intent on me. But other than that, almost no hint of bhakti. Sri Aurobindo says, you're going to find that the Gita will be talking about. So it's almost like this merging of individuality of non-dual Brahman, which in medieval Indian spiritual traditions is considered to be attained in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. Many of you have heard the term nirvikalpa samadhi. Sri Ramakrishna would often go into that state, and he would say it's exactly like this, is that you lose external consciousness, but you also lose this sense of subject-object duality. There's just Brahman and nothing else in this state. And Sri Aurobindo says, influenced by Sri Ramakrishna, that this Advaitic realization is the foundation for subsequent spiritual realizations grounded in bhakti, where you can still be fully active in the world. Okay, we'll get to it later, but just to anticipate briefly, Sri Ramakrishna distinguishes between the spiritual experiences of jnana and vijnana. And why am I mentioning in this context? Because chapter 7 is called Jnana Vijnana Yoga. And the terms Jnana and Vijnana come up in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 7, chapter 9, several places in the Gita. And there's a huge controversy about how to interpret these terms. And Sri Aurobindo and Swami Tapasanaji are the only commentators I'm aware of who, in a very interesting way, interpret these terms along the lines of Sri Ramakrishna. What does Sri Ramakrishna, that's why I'm giving you a little background on what does Sri Ramakrishna say. Sri Ramakrishna says, imagine that you're trying to climb up to the roof of a house. What do? You climb up the staircase. You leave the steps behind one by one. He likens that to the process of neti vichara. Not this. Neti is a term taken from which Upanishad? Upanishad's pop quiz. Neti, such a you all know the phrase, right? Neti, not this, or most of you. One of the oldest Upanishads. And I'm giving you an even bigger hint. One of the longest Upanishads. Take one guess, any of you. Don't be afraid. Yeah, see, there you go. Very well done. Exactly. Well done. Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. Correct. Neti neti is there. It's specifically mentioned. Neti neti atma. So Sri Ramakrishna says, climbing up the staircase, leaving the steps behind one by one is like the neti neti process of reasoning, discrimination, saying Brahman is not this world, Brahman is not this body, Brahman is not this mind, Brahman is not this, Brahman is not that. Neti neti. One by one. You climb up the staircase. Until what happens? You reach the roof. What does the roof signify? Nirvikalpa Samadhi. That's Brahma Nirvana. You merge your individuality in non-dual Brahman. But that's not all. And he calls that Jnana. Okay? Then he says, Jnana pore Vijnana. After Jnana comes Vijnana. So he says that in the state of Jnana, when you reach the roof, you realize the truth that Shankara taught. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. My true nature as non-dual pure consciousness alone is real. Everything else is unreal. My individuality is unreal. The personal God is unreal. The world, completely unreal. Then he says, some people, even after attaining the state of Jnana, can attain a further spiritual state called Vijnana. And here he says, this is like the person who, after reaching the roof, looks back at the staircase and says, wait a minute, but the staircase is made of the same materials as the roof. Bricks, lime, and brick dust. So why should I say it's unreal? The world is also a real manifestation of God. So he says the Vijnani is the one who, instead of thinking of Brahman only as impersonal, nirguna, sees it as the same reality as saguna also. The ultimate reality is both nirguna and saguna, both personal and impersonal. And because the Vijnani accepts Shakti, or the personal God, or whatever you want to call it, the Vijnani also sees this entire world as a real manifestation of God, of Shakti. And again, we're going to find that, and Sri Aurobindo makes a strong case for this. Chapter 7, that same Jnana Vijnana Yoga chapter. There's a famous shloka, Bahunam Janmanamante Jnanavan Mam Prapadyate Vasudevaha Sarvam Iti Samahatma Sudullabha. After many lifetimes, the great realized soul realizes Vasudeva Sarvam Iti. There's nothing but Vasudeva everywhere in the world. I see nothing but Vasudeva. This is more like what Sri Ramakrishna calls the Vijnani's realization. The Jnani is looking, if the Jnani sees the world at all, he or she sees the world as a dream. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Like, imagine you're in a dream and you know you're dreaming, so you're lucidly dreaming. You're a lucid dreamer. The Advaitic Jivan Mukta is like that. Somebody who's lucidly dreaming this world dream. But the Vijnani isn't seeing this world as a dream. The Vijnani is seeing the world as a playful manifestation of God. And himself or herself also as an instrument of God. Okay? So that's the difference. Anyway, that's a long detour, but I think it's useful just for kind of as a kind of prelude to what's coming in future chapters. But I bring this up because, according to Sri Aurobindo, even though he agrees with Shankara that Brahma Nirvana means merging your individuality in non-dual Brahman, according to Shankara, this is the be-all, end-all, final spiritual realization. That's it. That's liberation. You're done. Sri Aurobindo says, that's true. That is liberation. But liberation is not the highest goal. There's something greater than that. In Buddhism, there's an ideal called the Bodhisattva ideal. Does anyone know what the Bodhisattva ideal is? What does it mean to be a Bodhisattva?
Being enlightened, being born again and again.
Yes. Even after attaining liberation, you don't have to come back to the world. But the Bodhisattva, the vow, one takes a vow. The Bodhisattva takes a vow to come back again and again. Why? Why would you do that? Why would you put yourself through that? What are you, a masochist? No, what's the idea?
Guide others.
To help others out of their spiritual ignorance. Exactly. So Sri Ramakrishna says the Vijnanis are the ones who are like that. They can just merge their individuality in non-dual Brahman and just leave the body. But they choose to come back in the physical body to help others out of their spiritual ignorance. Okay. A direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, he was considered a spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna, Raja Maharaj, Brahmanandaji, the first president of the Ramakrishna mission. He would say that Nirvikalpa Samadhi is the beginning of spiritual life. It's a very interesting statement. It's considered usually to be the acme of spiritual life, and he says it's the beginning of spiritual life. So that's in line with the Sri Ramakrishna idea. It's a very, very lofty ideal. Okay. So I hope you understand the difference between Shankara's and Sri Aurobindo's take on this Brahma Nirvana. Now I want to mention one more interpretation of Brahma Nirvana just to add a little more fun to the mix. Ramanuja. Because remember, what's distinctive about Ramanuja? One of the things is he doesn't even believe, he doesn't accept the reality of Nirguna Brahman at all. Brahman is only Saguna, specifically Vishnu Narayana, Vishnu, with a very specific form, specific dress and earrings and the whole thing, mace, discus. So that's Brahman for Ramanuja. And Brahma Nirvanam, he can't take nirvana literally because Ramanuja believes in the eternal reality of individual souls. Why? Because for Ramanuja's school, it's a bhakti school of Vedanta. So what is the final goal? What is liberation according to Ramanuja? Have we ever talked about this? Can any of you guess? He's a bhakta. Yeah, very good. Exactly. If you've attained liberation and ultimately you exhaust all your prarabdha karma, what happens? You leave the physical body, but you remain as an eternal soul. You go to a higher transcendental realm and you dwell eternally with your favorite god, Vishnu, in this higher loka. And you lovingly serve him, you worship him, right? You praise him. This is heaven for Ramanuja. Because of that, a direct interpretation of or acceptance of nirvana is not really permissible for him because the individuality remains. So what does he say? He takes nirvana here to mean something very different from the Buddhist nirvana. He takes it to mean blissful. I don't know how that works etymologically. Maybe I bet that he was very smart and he knew Sanskrit inside and out. So he somehow managed to, he takes it to mean nirvanamayam Brahma. That Brahma Nirvana means nirvana mayam Brahma, the blissful Brahman. But here he takes Brahman not to mean Saguna Brahman at all. In this context, he takes it to mean the Jivatma. Because if you remember, I've been mentioning Ramanuja's commentaries once in a while, and consistently throughout chapter 2, whenever the Atman comes, he says, this is the Jivatma, which is separate from the body-mind complex, and which it's imperative for us to realize so that we can take a step back from the body-mind complex and ultimately be eligible to practice the higher spiritual practice, which is what? Bhakti Yoga. Exactly. So he sees this as concluding Bhagavan Krishna's description of Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga. This discipline of meditating on your true nature as the eternal Jivatman, the eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. That's how he takes this Brahma Nirvana. Nirvana in the sense of blissful, Brahman not as Brahman, even though he usually takes Brahman to mean Saguna Brahman, Vishnu. Here he's saying this is not Vishnu. Because it doesn't suit, the context doesn't suit his philosophy, basically. So instead he says, we have to take Brahman here to mean the individual soul, the eternal soul, and nirvana not to mean extinguishing of the soul, but rather, what? It just means blissful as an adjective modifying the soul. Because the Atman is blissful, the individual soul as such is blissful. It's because the soul ignorantly identifies with the body-mind complex that it suffers. But separated from the body-mind complex, it's blissful. So this is Ramanuja's interpretation. And again, I mentioned that Sri Aurobindo is constantly arguing with Shankara's commentary. Here again, Shankara takes this Brahmi Sthitihi to be a state after renouncing all actions. And again, the question is there any textual evidence for this? Is there any suggestion in the shloka itself or in the surrounding shlokas that this is the person who has abandoned actions? And Sri Aurobindo will say, no, we don't have good evidence for this. Even while acting continuously in the world, one can be firmly grounded in Brahman. This is how Sri Aurobindo interprets Brahmi Sthiti. So being grounded in Brahman is fully compatible with continuing to act in the world as a karma yogi, not as a karmi, just doing action, but doing action as worship. Doing it in an unattached manner. That's the key. That's the secret of work. Okay? Any questions before I sum up chapter 2? Yes, please.
So should we consider world as real or unreal? Or Vigyan?
Well, that's up to you. The question is, should we consider the world to be real or unreal? So, but according to some of these great saints, not just Ramakrishna, but Sri Aurobindo, I don't know how much you know about his life, but born in Bengal, his father was a hardcore Britishophile, Anglophile. So he loved the British, and he said, you need, for proper upbringing, you need to be sent to England. I'm going to send you to England, but before I do, I'm going to change your name from Aurobindo to Ackroyd. So he changes his name to Ackroyd and he sends him to England, ships him off to England. So he's raised in England, brilliant student. He goes to Cambridge University, studies classics, which means Latin and Greek. Then after studying classics, he comes back to India and he has this change of heart. But two different kinds of change of heart, actually, in two phases. First is he was a hardcore freedom fighter. And he ended up being imprisoned as a result. Interestingly, in prison, 1909, I believe, in the Alipur jail in Kolkata, what book was he reading intensely? This one, Bhagavad Gita. He himself says, I was practicing intensely the sadhana of the Gita. And then he says, he had this realization, exactly the one that is mentioned in chapter 7, Vasudeva Sarvamiti Samahatma Sudurlavaha. It says, I realized in my jail cell that I saw nothing but Vasudeva everywhere. In the prisoners, in the murderers, in the swindlers, in the prison bars, in the guards, the prison guards, in the blankets covering me at night. Everything I saw was Vasudeva. So he's practicing intensive Gita. That's a kind of a side note. But he also mentions that, I think this is before he went to jail, he was in Baroda. Is that in Maharashtra? Gujarat, Baroda. He meets this yogi named Vishnu Bhaskar Lele. And this Lele was a bhakta, actually. He was not an Advaita Vedanta. So he didn't believe that the world was a dream. This is a significant piece of information. But Sri Aurobindo was already a kind of advanced yogi without knowing it. So the moment that Lele started teaching him some yoga, some meditation instructions, Sri Aurobindo, he says within 3 days, he attains the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is this Advaitic realization. And then in a very beautiful way, he explains how he looked upon this world. So this is coming back to your question. He says, after I came down from the state of Samadhi, I saw this world as a cinematographic play of vacant forms superimposed on the impersonal Sadatman. It's just like a movie. It's like we go to a movie theater and we see a movie. We know it's not real. We might get involved in it, but we know but then we're going to ultimately, we might even cry, but those are different kind of tears than when our actual wife dies or son dies, right? It's not the same kind of. So, okay. So he says that was jnana. That was Advaita jnana that he had. But notice that the jail experience that he had shortly thereafter, about 9 to 10 months later, is a world-affirming one. He sees nothing but God in the entire world. So one way to answer your question, which your question was, should we see the world as unreal or real? One answer that saints give is that these are two different outlooks on the world at different stages in spiritual evolution. And that at one phase, you'll feel that this world is unreal. Not everybody, but some people, some spiritual aspirants go through this. And the subsequent phase and the even greater realization is that, no, wait a minute, the world's not unreal. The world itself is God. Okay? But another way to answer your question is, it depends on your temperament as a sadhaka or sadhika. And there's some people who are temperamentally inclined to look at this world as a dream, and they somehow find that to be spiritually productive for them. Because if the world is real, then there's more chance of attachment. You give more value to the things of the world. For other people, they'll say, no, I like to think of this world as real, but as impermanent. And it doesn't mean that I'll be a bhogi, that I'm going to rush headlong into worldly enjoyment. It's not that. Just because I think of the world as real doesn't mean that I'll be worldly and unspiritual. No, the idea is that I should try to see God in everything. And I should recognize that everything is, even if it's real, it's still impermanent. Nothing will last. no matter what enjoyment I'm engaging in, anityam asukam lokam. Bhagavan Krishna says this in chapter 9 at the end. Anityam asukam lokam. This world is anityam asukam. Non-eternal, impermanent, and asukam, completely devoid of happiness. But Bhagavan Krishna never says, of course, Shankara will disagree with me, but at least prima facie, which means at face value, none of the verses, the 700 verses, say that the world is unreal. But in many places, Bhagavan Krishna is saying the world is impermanent. But that impermanence itself is a reason for having vairagya, for being dispassionate toward worldly desires and attachments. And then there's another argument to be made against the outlook of that the world is unreal. And there's a danger in spiritual life for people who are spiritually immature, who look upon the world as unreal. You know what the danger is? This is another incident that happened in Sri Ramakrishna's life. One day, a sadhu wearing girua, a sannyasi, comes in his area. And Sri Ramakrishna hears some weird things about this sadhu. He hears that this person's having an affair with a woman, which is a no-no for monks, obviously. And so he approaches this monk. And he says, what is this I hear about this affair you have? I hope it's untrue. I hope it's just a scurrilous rumor. And this guy, he says, no. Let me explain. You see, this whole world is unreal. So how can my affair with that woman alone be real? Then Sri Ramakrishna is thoroughly disgusted. And he says, and it's such harsh language that it's watered down in the English translation. This is from the biography of Sri Ramakrishna. Well, I'll tell you what the translation says, then I'll give you the original Bengali. The English translation, the softened version is, I spit on your Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta. The original is, I piss on your Vedanta. I mean, mutedi, tor Vedanta mutedi, your Vedanta. This is not the real Vedanta. The real Advaita Vedanta true Advaita Vedanta like Shankara and his followers will not say this. But it can be easily abused. Why is this relevant now in 2023? Look at these, I don't know, any number of things like this movie, what do you call that? Ex Machina, have you heard of this?
Mhm.
It's a very interesting, especially for people in tech.
Which one?
Ex Machina. Westworld is a TV show, and it's the same theme. The idea is that at some point, artificial intelligence is going to become so sophisticated where, and the skin, the artificial skin is going to look exactly like human skin. You can't tell apart a human robot from a human being. And at that point, what are the ethical implications? And both of these shows, the movie and the show, explores these issues. One thing that obviously comes to mind is unlimited bhoga without the compunction of feeling like you're exploiting a human being. But they're not human beings. They're not real. They don't have consciousness. Let me do whatever I want with them. You see? So the danger in this, the world is unreal, you might think that this is the best way to have vairagya, dispassion to the world. It could be exactly the opposite. There are also lucid dreaming workshops now. Actually, I think these have been going on for some time. The idea is they'll teach you how to dream lucidly at night so that you can then fantasize about your favorite model or your Bollywood actress or whoever you love the most, and you can have fun with them. And it's a dream, so there's no harm. And then you come out of the dream and you go on with your way, and then in the dream again, you can enjoy. It's a wonderful thing. You get. So just because the world is unreal does not mean that you're going to have intense dispassion. It could be a justification for bhoga in the worst possible form. So I want you to think about these things. These are very interesting things. These are very, very relevant issues. ChatGPT 4, 5, 6. What about ChatGPT 50? It won't be like a Google search anymore. It'll be a human being, or not. Well, somebody who looks like a human being, talking to you like as if you're having a real conversation with somebody. Then how do you even know it's a robot anymore? So it blurs all sorts of ethical lines. Anyway, this is a long detour, but I think it's very interesting and important for us to think about. Good, very good question, actually. I don't even know if I answered it. But maybe it's better that I not answer it in that way, but think, I want you to think, Okay, good. Any other questions before I sum up chapter 2? Maybe what I should do, no, we have time. So, okay, let me sum up chapter 2 and then we'll start on chapter 3 and then we'll do a little meditation. But any questions before we, okay. So This is a very long chapter, 72 verses. This is a marathon. Second longest chapter in the Gita. Chapter 18, I think, is the longest, 78 shlokas. Where does the chapter begin? To remind you, Arjuna doesn't want to fight in this war. He says, no way, Jose. I'm not interested. They're my own kith and kin, my gurus, my loved ones. I don't want to fight them. I'd rather be a monk. So that good for nothings, they want to be monks. Got this a lot. Well, you did your PhD, now you're wasting your life. So anyway, okay. So Arjuna is like this. I want to be a monk. Krishna then, in response, he says in about 100 different ways. Do you remember? They're like 15 different shlokas explaining the same idea in different ways. Don't worry, Arjuna, because even if you kill your kith and kin, they're not going to die. Because their truest nature, because they're not their bodies. The body will die, but they are eternal souls, which can never be slain. You also are an eternal soul, which can never be slain. So even if you're killed in battle, you won't die. And in fact, if you're killed in battle, you'll be doing your duty as a warrior, as a kshatriya, and therefore you will attain heaven through this path and ultimately attain spiritual fulfillment. So it's a win-win situation for you. Whether you live or die, whether you kill others in battle, because you're fighting on the right side, on the just side. Of course, you shouldn't be fighting in war on Hitler's side. That's not good. Krishna's not encouraging that. But you're fighting for justice. And sometimes it's necessary to actually fight for justice physically, literally. Sometimes violence is necessary. You have to combat violence with violence. Tamas with tamas. Okay. So Bhagavan Krishna on the one hand is saying again and again, don't worry, you are an eternal soul, it can never die. And he adds, you must do your swadharma as a kshatriya, which is fighting in this war. But what is the attitude you should adopt when fighting? This is also mentioned in the Gita. What is the attitude? To be unattached. Be a karma yogi. Don't covet the fruits. Karma nyevadikaraste mapaleshu gadachana. You have the right to the action. You can fight. But don't have any kind of hankering for name and fame. I'm going to be glorified afterward as a great warrior and get in all the history textbooks and be praised by everybody. No, none of that. No. You might get success and you might get name and fame, but never covet it. Be a karma yogi. Okay. Then Arjuna asks this question. Okay, so you're saying that even through karma yoga, I can attain spiritual fulfillment. What are the external signs of somebody who has attained enlightenment, the sthita prajna? Why do I say external? Because he's literally asking, how does that enlightened person sit? How does he walk? How does he talk? Remember? And Bhagavan Krishna answers in a very interesting way. Most commentators seem to agree that his answer is a kind of non sequitur, because he doesn't directly answer Arjuna's question. He shifts the terms. He says, you're barking up the wrong tree, Arjuna, in asking for external signs, because the signs of a realized soul are never external, or rarely external at least. And the main signs are internal. What are the internal signs? The most fundamental sign is, hi, desirelessness.
We have, so AIS had an event, so they have some food. If you can
Oh, that's nice.
yeah.
Should we wait until after the class, or is it cold or hot now? Is it?
No, there's a boxes to.
Yeah, so we'll have it right after, so at 8:30, because the class actually started at 7 today,
Oh, okay.
because there was a holy party that they were. Yeah.
No,
Okay, so they'll be in the next room.
yeah.
Okay, sorry to people online for making you hungry. They're for making you jealous. Yes.
Or you could keep the ball.
Okay, so where were we? Oh yeah, so the most fundamental sign of being enlightened is the internal sign, which is desirelessness, being free from desires. This is what Krishna is hammering into us again and again. And don't bother so much about how the enlightened person walks or talks. That the enlightened person could be walking and talking and sitting just like any ordinary person. Nothing special. No long beard. No impressive meditation posture and staying in a cave without talking to people, observing mauna. Nothing. But that good person can be. It's really interesting. Have you heard of Nisargadatta Maharaj, Marathi saint, great Marathi saint? No, you should know. That's right, Lisa. Nisargadatta Maharaj, and there's a collection of his teachings called "I Am That." Just look him up on YouTube, and it's really funny. Have you seen it? This video on YouTube? So he's got. I mean, he's in a typical Mumbai kind of this like very very. It's like almost a shanty, like not a nice house with the fan going at full speed and dirty, and his clothes is unkempt, and there's all this traffic, highway noise, just like an ordinary uncle or something like that. And he had the highest Advaitic realization, and nothing but Advaitic nectar is coming out of his mouth. So this is Krishna's answer: is that don't expect they don't have to fill the enlightened person does not have to fulfill the stereotype of the great long-bearded yogi. Okay. Somebody. Kalpana's iPhone. Kalpana, could you please mute yours just so that we're not disturbed? Thank you. But welcome to the class. I don't know who you are.
Yeah, I got link. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, welcome. Is she a student at USC or something? No. Oh, we don't know. Anyway, no, you're welcome. You're more than. Oh, Kalpana Chakravarti. And now I know. Sorry, I know Kalpana now. You're the one who, yes. No, I'm glad you joined, Kalpana Ma. So you're more than welcome. I hope you keep coming. Okay. Sorry, I thought you were a USC student for a second there. Okay, now, and then I wanted to mention a couple other things in the summary of chapter 2. 2.61, shloka 61. That key little phrase, matparaha. Let me remind you of 61. Tani sarvani sanyamya yukta asita matparaha. Vashehi yasi indriyani tasya pragya pratishtita. So in the midst of explaining this sthita pragya, the enlightened soul, Krishna is saying, having controlled all of the sense organs, standing firm in yoga, asita matparaha, sitting matparaha, with his or her mind completely absorbed in me, in God, in Krishna. It's the only hint of bhakti we have in chapter 2. And the first hint, the first and only hint of bhakti in the Bhagavad Gita so far. And for Sri Aurobindo, for Ramanuja, for other bhakti schools who are writing commentaries on the Gita, this is absolutely essential. And you'll find that Ramanuja in every subsequent shloka is reading this matparaha into all of those other shlokas and saying that you have to presuppose bhakti in shloka 62 and 63 and 64 and 65 and 66. Even though it's not mentioned explicitly, we have to take it for granted because it's mentioned in 61. So even when you're practicing karma yoga, it's inflected by bhakti. It should also be grounded in worship of God, thinking of God. This is the bhakti approach. And Sri Aurobindo also accepts this, but what he says is that little matparaha, that little seed blossoms into a giant banyan tree in subsequent chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, ultimately becoming the keynote of the entire scripture. That through bhakti alone, you can attain the highest realization. Okay, so what are some of the key takeaways? Number 1, don't fear death. And don't be upset if your loved ones die, even. This is a kind of hard advice, but one of the reasons why in Hindu funerals, cremations, this najayate mriyate va kadachin, there's a famous shloka which we read several months ago in chapter 2 of the Gita. The soul is never born and never dies. This is often read in Hindu cremations to remind people who are mourning, not to pour salt on the wound or to be pretentious, but it's really true. It's really true that our loved ones never die. It's not possible to die because we were never born, let alone die. If you're not born, you can't die. So the soul lives on, and your loved one's going to come in the form of a pet, in the form of a loved one, a spouse or a kid, whoever it is, best friend. That person will come again in another body, so long as he or she has not exhausted her karma. And once she has, she attains liberation. Again, win-win. Either she comes back again, and who knows, in a future birth, you might also join her as her, in some other relationship. There are some funny cases where people claim that, like in this birth, they're the daughter of somebody, but in the previous birth, they were the mother of that same person, and they're like weird. How these things work are very complicated. I don't want to get into that. It gets strange. You might end up marrying your father or something. I don't know. Anyway. Okay. So don't fear death. Remember that you're the eternal Atman. Second key lesson, the practice of sense control is essential to realizing your true spiritual nature. This is hammered in again and again, especially in the Sthita Prajna Lakshana. Yada samharate chayam, so that analogy of the turtle. Just as a turtle withdraws its limbs when it wants to be free from external influences, just so the yogi should be able to spontaneously withdraw its sense organs from sense objects. And it's very, very practical. This is not just for highly advanced spiritual aspirants. Day-to-day life at a university on campus, I guarantee you, I'm sure you know people like this, people who rush headlong into sense enjoyments get neither bhoga nor yoga properly. They're not going to do well in school. They're going to be miserable. They will never have peace of mind. They'll be caught up in all sorts of drama. You'll just have to hear, they'll be talking your ear off about, oh, and then he said this, and then this, and then that, and that, and this. This is what you have to hear all day. How does this person live? Oh my goodness. Anyway, I'm not naming names. You all know okay. I have my own, not anymore. I guess even some monks indulge in drama. Yeah. Yes, please. The turtle analogy is shloka. I'll give you the exact shloka here. The shloka is Yada samharate chayam. Where is it exactly? Yes, 58, 2.58. Yada samharate chayam kurmongani vasarvashaha indriyan indriyarthebhyaha tasya prajna pratishtita. And Sri Aurobindo's translation is, who draws away the senses from the objects of senses, as the tortoise draws in its limbs into the shell, that person's intelligence sits firmly founded in wisdom. Okay? Okay. I almost feel like...
Can you give some practical
Yeah.
examples of
Yeah.
how this would look like in daily life for a student?
Yes, I can give you some, sure. Or you can give me examples, but let me give you some examples. One would be this. It's a Friday. It is Friday, so it's not hypothetical. And the weekend begins. There are all sorts of fun things that happen. And so there are frat parties, especially at a place like USC, fraternity parties. What happens in fraternity parties? Drinking and all sorts of other things. And there are also other things you can do on a Friday night. You might laugh, but I'm a lover of classical music, for instance. So I love classical music concerts. So for me, a nice Friday night would be going to a classical music concert. This is another example. Or spending a nice evening with your friends over tea and something. You know, there's so many different things you can be doing. You understand? And each one of these, whatever choice you make will have consequences. I'm not saying one is right and the other is wrong, but I'm saying go into be mindful in your choices. And as Swami Vivekananda used to say, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. Education through experience. Try to learn from your experiences, whatever they are, good or bad, stupid, smart, dumb, wise, prudent, imprudent. And I can guarantee you that you're going to find that if you make choices that kind of lean toward excessive sense indulgence, it'll make you miserable. It'll make you unhappy. It'll harm you in many other respects, academically and socially and otherwise. And there are kind of like famous cases of this blown up on a kind of massive scale with like super famous billionaires who end up getting in trouble. Why? Because look at why Trump just got indicted. After all, he just got indicted. But what's the reason? Finally, he paid off a porn star with hush money. He was the president of the United States, and he might go to jail because of this. You see how people they commit suicide because of this thing, karma. You can have everything, and yet you end up with nothing because you're not able to control yourself, restrain yourself. These cases can be multiplied. I mean, anyway, this is one example, but does that begin to?
Yeah.
And then I'm sure each of you in your own lives can think about, these things on your own. I'm not telling you to become monks, right? Do you understand what I mean? But it's about restraint, moderation, being prudent and mindful, and always keeping in mind Swami Vivekananda's advice. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. What do I have to learn from this experience? Okay. So now, because it's already 8:16, and I feel like starting on chapter 3 would become maybe shifting gears a little bit, because it's kind of a different themes. And so why don't we end with the meditation? And now that the president of HSO has announced that there's food waiting for us, I'm sure that you guys the stomachs are beginning to rumble as well. So I hope it doesn't disturb us in our meditation. Gently close your eyes. And today, in honor of shloka 70 of chapter 2, which is this Apuryamanam shloka, we should try to be like the ocean, which is completely undisturbed by streams rushing into it. So let's try to be like that ocean. Whatever thoughts, whatever feelings arise in the mind, just be mindful of them. So we're going to be doing a mindfulness meditation briefly today for about 10 minutes. Breathe in slowly and breathe out all your anxieties and worries. Breathe in. And breathe out. Now be mindful of your breath as you inhale and as you exhale. It might help to focus on the tip of your nostrils, where the breath comes in and out. So as you're practicing mindfulness of breath, you might find feelings coming up or thoughts coming up. Just ignore them. Let them come, let them go. Don't be disturbed by them. Just keep focusing on the breath as you inhale and as you exhale. If you find yourself getting distracted and the mind getting diverted from the breath, one thing you can do is mentally count each time you do an inhalation and exhalation. So mentally you can say 1 and then 2. That might help you to keep the mind concentrated on the breath. Now, shift your awareness to thoughts that arise in the mind. And all you should do is identify that thought. Don't react in any way. Just let it come and then let it go. Whatever the thought might be, good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant. Just take a step back from the thoughts and observe them. Gently release. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om.